Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I am going to be talking about 10 authors I have zero interest in reading anymore. I have nothing personally against these authors. It's just that for one reason or another, I don't really want to read their books anymore, which I will talk about further on in this video. If you see one of your favourite authors on this list, please do not come and attack me. We have very different tastes. Humans have different tastes. And that's okay, we should celebrate those differences. Feel free to disagree, obviously, but if I see any rude comments, you will just be blocked straight up. One last thing I will add is that there is no prioritization to the list. Everyone on this list has equal weight. So now let's jump in. So the first person on this list is Sarah J Maas. I've enjoyed some of Sarah J Maas's books. I quite enjoyed the Throne of Glass series. There's definitely issues with it, and I'm sure if I reread it now, I'd probably pick up on those a lot more. But it was one of those series that actually really got me back into fantasy, because I've always read a lot of books, but I've primarily read a lot of historical fiction and a lot of contemporary fiction, but I didn't read tons of fantasy. Like, I read Harry Potter when I was a child, and I read the Philip Pullman series, but beyond that, and I obviously knew about Lord of the Rings, but beyond that, I didn't really read that much fantasy. Fantasy's only really been something that I've really picked up over the last couple of years. So Sarah J Maas actually played quite a critical role in opening my world up to different types of fantasy. This one being kind of adventure fantasy with very strong romance elements. I thought was fun at the time. Again, if I reread it now, I'd probably have massive issues with it. But the thing about this author is that as I've read more and more of her books in the ACOTAR series, her writing has got worse. Now, she's one of those people, I think, because she has a certain level of popularity and notoriety in the publishing world, in the book sphere, her publishers know, and she herself probably knows, that her books will sell well, regardless of how she writes. And I think this to me is the perfect example of quantity doesn't necessarily mean quality. This publisher has released so many books and has sold so many books, but that doesn't mean that you are a good writer. I think she had some promise. And I've said this before, I love seeing authors that I've read grow and develop. Unfortunately, I've seen Sarah J Maas regress and undevelop. And it's very frustrating because I expect more, to be honest. And that's from anyone who's a master of their craft or allegedly a master of their craft. I would say exactly the same thing about a musician or an actor or a theatre actor or a game developer. You know, if they started off strong and had promise and then they hit a certain level of success and started to regress, it would really annoy me, because for me it just shows that maybe she's got a little bit lazy at her craft. And at the same time, it's also shown that publishers don't really do their jobs and actually provide critical feedback. Because the last book that I read, The House of Sky and Breath, was one of the worst books I have ever read, full stop. I had lots of issues with the plot and the character, but the writing itself was absolutely ridiculous. I could have written a better book than that. I'm not exaggerating, and I am not a writer. So take that whatever way you want to take it, but she has a new book coming out January of next year, if I remember correctly. I have very little intent to pick it up. Normally I pre-order her books, but I haven't pre-ordered this one. I will see what the reviews say, and if there's anybody whose opinion I trust, who talks about it positively, then I will consider picking it up. But otherwise, this author is definitely a no-go. Wow, I talked about her for ages. Next on my list, we have another very popular fantasy author who unfortunately is no longer with us, and that is Robert Jordan. So I have read the first 3 Wheel of Time books and I'm done. It's really unfortunate because I have the next 4 books, and then they're really nice floppy covers, but it's not for me. It's really not for me. I cannot stand prose that is overly wordy, overly descriptive. I just can't do it. I don't want to do it. I can't do it. So I'm done with it. I've heard that it gets better. I've heard book 4 is actually really good. And then I think book 5 or book 6 is when the slog starts. And then it gets good again around book 8 or 9, I think. I do not want to waste hours and hours of my time reading a series where it's very commonly admitted that the middle chunk of the series is badly written. So I find it very odd that people are willing to read 4 or 5 books that there is a general consensus that are bad, I find it really shocking that people are willing to read that many books to get to the ending. What I ended up actually doing a couple of weeks ago was just reading a pretty detailed summary of what happens at the end of the book, and I predicted most of it. So it doesn't really seem like I was missing out on much anyway. It's sad because I actually really wanted to join the Robert Jordan hype train, because I think there's certain things that he does really well, but knowing that there's going to be 5 books or 4 or 5 books that I'm not going to enjoy, and bear in mind I found the first like 2-3 books really difficult, which are considered to be good, so I had to bow out of that one, unfortunately. Next on my list we have T. Kingfisher. So I've only read 1 book by T. Kingfisher, and you're probably thinking that's a little bit too soon to judge. But it's funny because I actually got approved for an e-arc for T. Kingfisher's new book. And I started to read it and I ended up kind of DNFing it. I don't really like the concept of DNFing. I'm not really a DNFer. I never just stop reading a book. I'll always kind of try to push through to the end, even if it means that I just end up skimming. But I just don't think their writing style really matches what I like consuming. And I read one of their books, Sword Heart, which just did not gel with me. I don't know what it is specifically. I think it's maybe the way that they write characters or something. Or maybe it's just their character types. I just don't really gel with the characters. I don't really like the way that the characters are written. I don't know. I think I'm being overly judgmental considering that I've only read 1 book and then a few chapters of their new book. But at the same time, you like what you like, and you can generally tell whether you like someone's writing, even if you might not necessarily like that specific book. Like, I've read books by authors that I like the writing, but maybe just the plot didn't work for me. And for me, it was, for this one, there wasn't anything that I really connected with where I was like, oh my gosh, I really want to read from this author. It's really disappointing as well, because I actually like the sound of a couple of their books, but it is what it is. Next on my list, we have Andy Weir. So this is the author of Project Hail Mary and then The Martian. I read Project Hail Mary last year and I ended up giving it a 4 stars, which I think is way too generous. I think I would probably give it a 3.5 or maybe even a 3.25 stars in hindsight. I just felt like it dragged. I know a lot of people connect with the main character. I know a lot of people rave about The Martian as well, but I just don't really get the hype. Like, I think he writes pretty well, but I've heard that there's a lot of similar thematic work and character work done across his books, and I'm just not interested in reading that type of writing again and again and again. I feel like it would probably get quite repetitive. If you are somebody who's read multiple books of his, please let me know if that assumption is true. If it's not, then maybe I'll reconsider. But from what I know, lots of similarities, and I'm good. All right, next on my list, we have Olly Blake. This is the author of The Atlas 6. Did not like that book at all. A book that got a lot of hype, a lot of very, I don't want to say undeserved hype. It's a bit harsh. It's more that I just don't think the book was good. It's described as kind of like grim, dark academia, which I don't think it is grimdark. I think people automatically label a book grimdark if the characters are morally grey. But a lot of the characters, if not all of the characters in that book, were just really unpleasant, and not in the way where, like, yeah, they're morally grey and, you know, you kind of feel torn about supporting them. They were just all like horrible people, and I just did not like any of them. There's plenty of characters that I've read that are awful people, but I still bat for them. Did not feel like that with any of these people. And bear in mind, we're following like 5 or 6 different POVs. I did not connect with one of them. I have zero intention of reading this author's other books. It is what it is. All right, next on my list. This is a big one. And it's really unfortunate, actually, because I have a lot of books by this author. But I think there's something about his writing style that just does not gel with me, and that is Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is one that I think I will revisit maybe in a year or two and try again. But I've read 2 of his books. I tried to read his most recent book a few weeks ago, and I just couldn't do it. It's very dense, but I've read dense fantasy before and I've really enjoyed it. But there's something about his writing that I just cannot ingest in the way that I would ingest someone like Baker, who is the most dense fantasy writer in general that I've ever read. And yet Tchaikovsky, I wouldn't say he's as dense as Baker, and yet there's something missing in his writing for me that makes it really difficult for me to consume his books. I feel like reading a chapter of one of his books compared to, say, like a Joe Abercrombie book or a Baker book or a Parker book, it takes me significantly longer to read a chapter of a Tchaikovsky book than it does to any of those authors. And I just have no idea why. No idea why. And it's really annoying because a lot of his book premises are absolutely fascinating and they, on the surface, sound like things that I would love. And yet there's just something in his writing that just does not gel with me. I'm really curious if anybody else has had this experience too, because this one for me, I think, is the most disappointing because his books really align with the sort of things that I like, but it's just the writing that's holding me back. We'll give this one another go, but for now, not a priority at all. All right, the next one is actually a historical fiction writer, a very, very popular one. I know a lot of you who watch my channel are fantasy lovers, but some of you read historical fiction too, so you may or may not know about this author. And that is Kristen Hannah, and she wrote The Nightingale. She's written a lot of like World War II historical fiction. I just found her writing very meh. You know, I remember coming off the back of reading that book feeling pretty underwhelmed. I'm also wondering whether the fact that the time period that the book is set in maybe impacted my rating as well and my view, because World War II is a period of history that I know a lot about. Like, I know a lot about it. I've read a lot about World War II. I've also studied it a lot at school. It's like the one period of history that you learn every year at school, which it's important to learn, but at the same time, there's so much else that I would like to learn about in the world. And so I know that period of history like super well. And so when I read a historical fiction book about it, I want it to feel very grounded. I want it to feel very authentic. And for me, I just did not get that. And I think maybe because it's set in France, and I know a little bit about what France's occupation was like under Nazi Germany, but it just didn't kind of match up with what I was expecting, which is maybe where the issue is. She's written a lot of books, and I just don't think I will ever pick up a book by her because I just found it to be very simplistic. And yeah, that's it. Just very simplistic. And not in a good way. Like, simple doesn't mean bad, by the way. There's many authors that I like that write simply, but they write very beautifully, and the characters and the plot and the pacing, all of those things align really well. That's not the case in this one. All right, we're down to the last three. So the next one is an author that I have talked about pretty negatively on my channel, and that is Jennifer L Armentrout. She is the author of, I can't even remember the name of the series because I've mentally blocked it out of my head. I will put a picture though, just so that you all know what series I'm referring to. Worst writer I've ever read, hands down. Absolutely awful. Absolutely awful. Like, I physically cringe thinking about the fact that I read 3 of her books, and they're not small books, they're very chunky books. So much context, so much information dumping, very bad character work, awful, awful dialogue. Just like, oh, just not good. Really, really bad. And I've heard that it just gets worse and worse and worse. And I'm so glad I tapped out when I did. I wish I tapped out after book 1, but I think I felt an obligation to my friends in the book community who were reading it. And this is why, folks, you should just read what you like, not what other people like, and never ever buy into the hype train. Because I think this was me pushing through with this series was a direct result of a bunch of people raving about fantasy romance and Jennifer L Armentrout being the next Sarah J Maas. And it was just absolutely shocking. Absolutely shocking. Genuinely worst writing I've ever read in my life. All right, penultimate one is V.E. Schwab. So V.E. Schwab, I've read a few of her books now. I really like The Vicious Duology, but I feel like her books are very samey. I own quite a few of her books. I own the Darker Shade of Magic trilogy. I own The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, which got so much hype. And I tried reading it a few times and it's just not it. It's just not it. My issue with V.E. Schwab is more about the fact that her books are very Anglo-centric. They're very white. And by that, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. I read a lot of authors who write a lot of Western fantasy or Western historical fiction. And so primarily the character list is very, Anglo-centric or Caucasian. But, she wrote a book about a woman who I think like time travels, right, to different periods of history, and every single person she meets is white. And it just makes me wonder, like, what is going through that person's head. Like, it genuinely makes me wonder, like, what is this person thinking about? What is her frame of reference for the history of the world? And that, like, massively just put me off her writing. Very similar to Sarah J Maas. I mean, Sarah J Maas has all the same character types. It's all the same people. Very, very huge lack of diversity. And look, again, like I said, I'm not one of those people, I need like diversity in every single book that I read. It's not even something that I actively look for, to be honest. But I find it weird, using like the Sarah J Maas example, where like we get exposures to so many different kingdoms, and yet there's only one part of the world where there's brown people, and they don't exist anywhere else. And then with Addie LaRue, she like literally time jumps to different parts of history. And like, I think it's like 99% of the people that she meets are white. I don't know, guys. I'm just so done with like reading ignorant literature. Like, I think when a big part of your book is about like adventure and exploring the world and exploring different cultures, you cannot make it Anglo-centric or Western-centric, in my opinion, unless there's a very specific reason to be. And I just find it very strange that this author made that choice. Very odd. And I have zero desire to read any of her books now. Lastly, on my list, this is going to be a very controversial one, and I'm probably going to get some haters, so guess I better warm up my block button. And that is Brandon Sanderson. I have a lot of Brandon Sanderson books. I have the Stormlight Archive books, which I will read eventually. Not anytime soon. Probably not in the next 5 years, to be honest. I have zero desire to read Brandon Sanderson in the next, 5 years. Why? I'm just not a big fan of his writing style. It's very wordy, very descriptive. Sometimes it feels very disjointed. I very rarely connect with his characters. I really like Mistborn Era 1, and I loved Warbreaker and The Emperor's Soul. I quite liked Elantris too. But beyond that, and even then I had issues with those books, specifically the way that they were written. But there's just something about his writing that just really irks me. And it's because he takes 100 words to say something that could be said in 20. And I don't like that. I like my writing to be very precise and specific. I like a bit of world building and description now and then, but I don't want that to be it for the whole book. And the other thing about Brandon Sanderson is his humour is just not my humour. I have really dark humour. It's why I love Abercrombie and Parker. Brandon Sanderson's humour is just not it. It's very childish humour, which maybe that's the demographic that he's appealing to, but that's very odd to me because his demographic tends to be kind of older, because his demographic tends to skew slightly older. I mean, I know he has some YA stuff, but I'm talking about more of his adult stuff. So I don't really get it. I don't really get the humor and the mismatch with the writing. I don't really get the humor and the mismatch with the audience. Maybe that's just his humor as well. Like, I don't want to insult someone's humor if that's just their humor, but it just made me disconnect from the story many times, and I just have very little to zero desire to read any more Brandon Sanderson for a very long time. I'm just done with it. They also tend to be very big books, and I have to love the author or be very excited about the premise for the book for me to want to read it now. And I just have zero desire to read Brandon Sanderson. Sad, because I do like some of his books, but it is what it is. And there we have it. There are 10 authors I have zero interest in reading. There is another idea that I have for a video, which is mentioning authors that I don't want to read because of maybe controversial reasons. There's a few authors that I do have on my list that I don't want to read because of things that they've said or done. That for me, I'm a pretty, I like to read anything. I like to read people whose opinions I disagree with. I like to read things that make me feel uncomfortable. It's always been a part of who I am. But there's certain things that certain authors have said or done that are just, in my opinion, outrightly wrong. And I will never, ever buy their books to support them. And I will highly doubt I will ever do a review on my channel to support them. So I'm thinking of doing that video, but I don't know, because it will be a very short list. There's not many people on that list, I think. But I don't know. If that's interesting to you guys, let me know. I'll consider doing it. But like I said, it's a short one. But with that, thanks for watching. Stay safe as always. Let me know down below if there's any authors that you have previously read that you're now not really in the mood to read, and we'll chat below. Thanks for watching, folks. Stay safe as always. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.